Are you guys ready? Andrew, John, are you ready?
Yes.
Yep, ready.
Great. Good evening and welcome. My name is Trent Soulard. I'm with the Rare Books and Manuscripts Department here at St. Louis Public Library. Thank you for joining us for the third of 3 fall lectures of the 2022 Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis chapter and the St. Louis Public Library Steedman Architectural Library Lecture Series. Before we begin, we ask that you please mute your devices. Should you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A section. After our talk tonight, we will pose your questions to Andrew Weil. And now I'd like to introduce John Gunther, FAIA LEED AP, an architect who serves as president of the Society of Architectural Historians, St. Louis chapter. He will introduce our speaker for this evening's talk. John?
Thank you, Trent, for your welcome and for hosting this talk. Please know how appreciative we are to the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, for our continued collaboration for our lecture series over the years. It is my privilege to introduce our friend and colleague and tonight's speaker, Andrew Weil. Andrew Weil has been the director of the Landmarks Association of St. Louis since 2011. He holds a master's degree in historic archaeology from the University of Maryland and has worked in the field of cultural resource management as a professional historian, architectural historian, and archaeologist. Over the course of more than 20 years, Weil has worked to explore and protect history from the battlefields of Maryland to the desert Southwest. After returning to his native St. Louis in 2005, he joined the staff of Landmarks Association. Today, Weil is known as a well-known authority on the historic architecture of St. Louis, with a special interest in the region's earliest buildings and archaeology. In 2009, he was honored by the Osage Nation for his efforts to protect the only remaining Native American mound in St. Louis. Weil taught historic preservation in the graduate architecture program at Washington University and has personally listed thousands of buildings in St. Louis and around the state in the National Register of Historic Places. Tonight, Andrew will present the Soulard Settlers' Cottage, the journey from ruin to renewal for an abandoned antebellum home. Since 2019, Landmarks Association of St. Louis has been working to rehabilitate a building complex on 9th Street with roots dating back to the earliest years of what St. Louisans now know as the Soulard neighborhood. Beginning with the construction of a one-room stone cottage prior to the subdivision of the Sarria and Soulard lands, the buildings underwent multiple construction episodes as the neighborhood matured in the years leading up to the Civil War. Occupied for approximately 140 years, the primary residence was abandoned in approximately 1980. After decades of vacancy, the home had fallen into a state of severe disrepair when it was donated to Landmarks to serve as a new educational and office complex in 2019. Tonight, Landmarks Executive Director Andrew Weil will take you through the history of the property and the many fascinating things the buildings revealed during what can only be described as a transformational rehabilitation process. And now, please welcome Andrew Weil as he presents the Soulard Settlers' Cottage, the journey from ruin to renewal for an abandoned antebellum home. Andrew?
Thanks, John. I think you said it all. Everyone, please hold your applause. This is a new experience for me. I have not done a remote presentation before, so bear with me. It's also a brand new presentation in itself for me. So if I stutter on a slide or two, forgive me. But we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I hope you find it interesting. I know that I do. This has been a long process, and one that is not finished yet. It was interrupted by COVID and all of the supply chain issues that have plagued the construction industry in recent years. But we're getting close. I hoped we'd be a little closer, but we're getting very close right now. They're doing a lot of finishing work. So you'll see that. You'll see the journey. There's really three components to this talk. There's the background history of the property, the landholders, the builders, some speculation about the earliest component of the buildings. Also, sort of the subtext is the sorts of resources that are out there for people who are doing research on historic buildings in St. Louis, and many of which, as wonderful resources, are housed at the St. Louis Public Library. So thank you to them for hosting me tonight, and thank you to the Society of Architectural Historians and the Steedman Library. And then the third component is a progress report on and what our intentions for this really remarkable building complex are. I definitely want to say thanks really quickly to my colleague Katie Graby, who did the lion's share of the historical research for this presentation. So thank you to Katie. So let's just jump into it. This is the next slide. Sorry, I need to get used to the advance the slide request. We're really fortunate in that we have a historic photograph of the home we're discussing this evening. This is probably about the 1890s. As many of you know who are researchers in architectural history and genealogy and so forth in St. Louis, it's very rare to find a photograph of any given historic home on any given street. They're just really few and far between. So this was amazing to have this photograph to work from. And because we have this photograph for our rehabilitation of the property, we decided to try to do as faithful a reconstruction of the 19th century as close as we could get to the original primary elevation. And as you'll see later, that we've done our best to repurpose and adapt this building while retaining and embracing as much of the historic fabric as we could. I got a little bit ahead of myself because I need to say that for those of you that are unfamiliar, Landmarks Association is a historic preservation advocacy group. We are a nonprofit organization, an independent nonprofit organization that was founded in 1959 to be an advocate for historic preservation in St. Louis. And we really operate on three pillars of activity: educational programs, advocacy on behalf of policies that help support preservation and in the St. Louis region, and promotion of our incredible architectural heritage as the economic and cultural asset that it is. So that's us in a nutshell. And this is going to be our new office. Back in the 1970s, our organization was involved in multiple rehabs in the Soulard neighborhood, trying to demonstrate that many of these old buildings that were really run down, that there was a market for them and that they could be adapted and reused, and they would be valuable and sought after. But since that time, we have not been involved directly in brick and mortar rehab. So this is an exciting step to us, and in some ways a return to our roots. So back to this historic photograph, we were able to obtain this photograph, and then next slide, please. We found another photograph in the Historic American Building Survey, which was a federal program during the Depression that is responsible for documenting an enormous amount of historic architecture in St. Louis and all across the country. So you can see half of the building essentially in this photograph from the 1930s, and both buildings, the buildings on either side, are both still there and look essentially exactly the same. So it's really a remarkable find. And then next slide. In the Swakowski collection from the mid 20th century, we found another photograph of the building. So we really lucked out, given the fact that it's very difficult to find any specific building. We found 3 historic photos of the building, and if anybody has any more, please reach out. We can never have too many of those buildings or photographs. I'm sorry. Next slide, please. This is the building that was donated to us by Youth Education and Health in Soulard, which is a fellow nonprofit that's been active in Soulard. As a social service organization and does a lot of wonderful things. Has had a relationship with the organization through board members for many years. And when we left our office space on Washington Avenue, they approached us with this opportunity, and we jumped at the opportunity, despite the fact that the building was in very difficult condition. But we saw potential there, and we wanted to save this building because it was probably doomed because of the extent of the necessary rehabilitation. So we took on the challenge, and we are keeping this building for St. Louis and for future generations. Let's see, next slide. The first thing we had to do, though, as we prepared to begin work, was to brace the front wall, which was bowing extremely out over the street and threatening to fail. And, P.T. Barnum said, all publicity is good publicity, but I don't think that this wall coming down on Mardi Gras would have been particularly good publicity. So we built this massive brace and then got to work. And next slide, please. The vision for the building, and there's substantially more to the buildings. It's actually a 2 separate building complex. There's an alley house, the front building, and the front building that you're looking at now has a rear L that actually contains a much older building, which we'll get into later. But it's a building complex that evolved over many years, and it was very challenging to rehab. And I look forward to having everybody down there to come see it, and we should be there pretty soon. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And next slide, please. So again, for you genealogists and land researchers, people out there, this is some background on land ownership and the families that comprised a lot of Soulard. You've got the Saray family and the Soulard family. This is this 1803 survey of Upper Louisiana, actually done by Antoine Soulard just prior to the Louisiana Purchase. The property on the right is a Spanish land grant granted to Gabriel Saray, who was Antoine's father-in-law. The land on the left, where the building that we're discussing is, was granted to Antoine Soulard. And then those 2 parcels eventually came under the control of the Soulard family Antoine Soulard's family and Julia Serret Soulard, his wife, Gabriel Serret's daughter, by virtue of transfer, intrafamily transfer upon death and marriage. But you can see the Mississippi River, and let's see. Next slide, please. Here's some perspective on where these two properties are. You can see in this 1841 map, Choteau's Pond is still there. Main Central Business District is to the north or the right of that. You go downhill to the Mill Creek Valley and the pond, and then back up the hill to Frenchtown, and then into the Soulard lands. And the little yellow dot is our property in 1841. Next slide, please. So this is another map from 1839. Oh, I'm sorry, 1842. This is the Ottawa map. And something that I think is interesting about this is the land hasn't been subdivided yet. So there are a few streets laid out, but for the most part, the land has not been subdivided, and you can see various sort of planned or anticipated streets or existing streets, and then other essentially tracks going through the land. But there are very few buildings, and the property is essentially intact in terms of the original Spanish land grants. And you can see the Antoine Soulard under Gabriel Serret at the bottom there, and then Antoine Soulard to the north there, and that's Broadway running between them. And then in the corner in the red circle is Gabriel Serret's country estate and a home that he built there to escape the congestion of the city, and the family later relocated to that property. Next slide, please. This is just another, yet another map that depicts the area. This shows the evolution where the subdivision of that area had taken place, and the right-of-ways for the various streets had been granted. And the star is the property along Decatur Street, which had been created at that point. But my contention is that the earliest portion of the property, or earliest portion of the buildings, predate the subdivision of this section of Soulard, and that it was not originally built to address Decatur, because Decatur didn't exist at the time. Lafayette, however, on the north side of the property did exist, and in a peculiarity of street subdivision. Now you can see immediately north to the right of the star is Lafayette Avenue, and then to the north of that is Soulard Avenue. Those two streets have subsequently switched. So now the earliest portion of the building faces Soulard Avenue, and Lafayette is the street to the north there. So that's confusing. But those are earlier streets, and the original building there faces north toward Lafayette rather than east toward Decatur or 9th Street, because that street didn't exist when it was built. Next slide, please. This is really just one more slide of maps that are available of the area for all you researchers out there, and the superposition of the Spanish land grants upon them. Next slide, please. So who was Gabriel Serre? He was a merchant from Montreal. People know Serre Street or Serre Street, which is not, sort of buried in the, well, it doesn't matter. But he came to the Illinois country in the 1750s and operated as a merchant and trader out of Kaskaskia. And due to all the turmoil of the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, et cetera, moved to St. Louis in 1779. Next slide. This is more information than probably anybody wants, but to summarize it, this is information on the property that Serre purchased in the original town of St. Louis, purchasing a full block where he again operated as a merchant. This was basically his home in the town of St. Louis. Was located where the very close to where the old parking garage for the Arch was located. Next slide, please. Oh, hold on, we're on the wrong one. Can you go back one slide, please? Oh, where'd that go? All right, forward one, please. All right, well, oh, there it is. So Serre had a number of children. Among them was Marie Julia, who married Antoine Soulard. And as a result, much of his land in the immediate vicinity of St. Louis passed to her, and more accurately to her husband, and then eventually back to her when her husband Antoine passed away. But that's sort of the original land disposition. So it was crown land, and then was granted to Gabriel Serre and Antoine Soulard as land grants. And then when the families merged, their land holdings in this vicinity merged. Next slide, please. So, in St. Louis, it seems like everybody knows everybody in some way, or very, 6 degrees of separation. These are the 2 town lots, town blocks, downtown on the Arch grounds. The lower one was owned by Gabriel Serre, and the upper one was owned by Antoine Soulard. This is obviously a later map from 1859. And they owned these entire town lots, town blocks that were then subsequently subdivided, mostly for mercantile and trade purposes, as the city became more established. And you can see by 1859 they've been completely subdivided and built up. But they lived down, and these town lots in their early years would have not been densely developed the way we think of the old riverfront as being. In their day, in the late 18th century, it would have been a settlement pattern more similar to what you see in St. Genevieve, where you have a main house, and you may have slave quarters and dependencies, chicken coop, smokehouse, ice house, gardens, all of that sort of stuff, occupying these large town lots. And then as development pressure increased as the city came into its own. The land became too valuable to hang on to and not allow it to be subdivided. So they eventually divested of those properties and moved out of the core of the commercial district. And in the case of the Antoine and Julia Soulard and Gabriel Suret families, they vacated these town lots and moved to Gabriel Suret's country estate south of town in that land grant that we were looking at before, to a property that was just described as a stone house, a 1.5-story stone house, which was located at the southeast corner of Park and what's now Broadway. Next slide, please. And here you can see where that house is located within at that time, you can see Antoine Soulard under Gabriel Suret, meaning it was passed from Suret to Soulard. And then the survey number 1333 represents the Americans coming in after the Louisiana Purchase and adjusting, is what they called it, land claims, and taking them from, they were Spanish land grants, and they resurveyed things and verified people's claims to the land under the new administration. So that's a survey number there, and that's Gabriel Suret's house. Julia and Antoine lived there during Gabriel's life and afterward. After Antoine passed, Julia and their children remained there until the 1830s, and then subsequently built a house of their own. Next slide, please. These are descriptions of Gabriel Suret's country estate. It talks about where it was and how he lived in the winter in the town, and in the summer moved out to his far distant country place, which now is Soulard, and how he had wonderful orchards and fruit orchards out there, and which was really a common pattern of life for landed, wealthy gentry in St. Louis in the 18th and 19th century, that people would escape the congestion and the chaos of the city for country lands and country estates if they had them. And you can see that pattern persists through. It's common to see in even the Compton and Dry 1875 map, where there are, these truck farms and orchards and things like that surrounding the core of the city, and but embedded in the lands outside the city are still country estates where people who had the means would build houses and spend time out there in the summertime. I think it's important to note, actually, can we go back one slide? It's important to note that for the rest of the story, that these lands, prior to subdivision, these lands were used by people, not just the Soulards, not just the Surets, but people who had these land grants on the edges of the city. The common landholder had access to the common lands and to the commons, as did everyone who owned property. But these wealthy landowners that had land grants basically had their own private common. And so they could send workers, or in many cases slaves, out onto those properties, and they would run, to collect firewood, to forage for things like hickory nuts and walnuts, forage for harvest building materials like stone. They had all of this land and all of the resources of the land at their disposal. So they would send people out onto these lands and to work, and because it took so long, people are primarily walking, or riding a horse or towing an ox cart. Depends on what they're up to and what their means are. But the point is that it was kind of a long way from the city at the time, from the heart of settlement. And so it made sense that rather than wasting time going back and forth every day and spending hours going back and forth to these lands to do whatever it is that they're doing out there, that they would build a shelter on the property, so that a work crew could go out there and work for a week or two and spend the night and not have to waste time going back and forth. And so that's relevant to a working theory with regard to the earliest component of this property that we're busy rehabbing. So next slide, please. And next slide, please. So this is a depiction of Julia's home that she, after Antoine passed and after all of the various land claims were settled, she built a new home, which was just south of the St. Vincent de Paul Church, which is still standing. That home was destroyed when they put the interstate through, but it was located at the northwest corner of 9th and Marion. So if you're facing St. Vincent de Paul from the highway, essentially, and look to the left, that's where her home was. And that's a photograph. Again, that's a Swakowski collection photograph from the Missouri History Museum up there on Decatur Street, interestingly enough, which is 9th Street. The highway has sort of disconnected what was once a coherent neighborhood and created a sort of arbitrary division, an arbitrary boundary. But 9th Street used to go straight through and all the way down to where our property is. And it's just a few blocks. So next slide, please. So that property, here's another depiction. This is from the Palminteri bird's eye view, which many people don't, it's far less well known, this map, than the 1875 Compton and Dry map, but there is another bird's eye, substantially earlier, of St. Louis, and it's an amazing resource. It's in the Missouri History collection, the original, but it's been digitized, so you can use it for your own purposes. But it's another depiction of Julia's home in the 1850s. Later, the home passed to one of her sons, Benjamin, and then passed to St. Vincent de Paul Church. So one more, next slide, please. And this is one more view of Julia Soulard's home. And again, this goes back to the 1933 Historic American Buildings Survey, which is also available online through the Library of Congress and has a lot of really fascinating stuff. Next slide, please. So continuing the pattern of the Soulard family living in the immediate vicinity. You've got Gabriel Serre's home, and then you've got Julia's home, and then this is Henry or Henri Soulard's home, which was located at the southwest corner of what is now Lafayette Avenue and Tucker, 12th Street. So even though it says Soulard Street, that's a remnant of the street name switching. And then Hamtramck Street is 12th Street. So that currently is a vacant lot. I believe that there was a filling station there, in the late 20th century, but it's a lot that's been for sale for many years. But that's the Henri Gustave Soulard property. And again, you can see how they had these large sort of rural estate lots as the neighborhoods around them subdivided and became incredibly dense. Some of these old family lots stayed intact while the neighborhoods developed around them. And incidentally, that's the same case with William Russell's property, another large Soulard landowner for whom Russell Avenue is named. His Crystal Spring farm remained a large land grant property well into the 19th century as the neighborhood became incredibly dense around it. And then finally development pressure led to it being subdivided and built up into the land that we know today. Henry Soulard is relevant because the property that we are rehabbing passed from his mother, Julia, to him, and his name is on the deed that when the land passed to the next family, which we'll get to in a second. Next slide, please. So again, back to the palmistry view, this is Henri Soulard's home in 1858. You can see how rural it was at that time, despite the fact that the land immediately to the east was developing at a breakneck pace, and the land around him would soon be doing the same thing. Next slide, please. So here to the right, we have, this is 1875. We have Julia's property, number one. 3 blocks to the south, we have the property that we're developing, number 3, which is completely built by that time, as you can see. And then to the west, 2 blocks, 2.5 blocks is Henri Soulard's property. And then I couldn't fit it on, but diagonally down to the right-hand corner would have been Gabriel Serre's property. So if you can imagine all of this land with no buildings on it, unsubdivided, you can see the whole family sort of settling in this area. And that begs the question in my mind, is the early component of our property an outbuilding or a building that either slaves or laborers used and was built for the Soulards, for people that were working on this very large piece of land, because it really triangulates nicely. And again, our earliest component was listed on the deed by Henri Soulard when it passed out of the family. There is a building on this property, and that's interesting to me because it was Soulard property it had not been subdivided. It was Soulard property when it passed from the Soulards to the next owners. So if it's private property, why is there a home there or a building there if it's not associated with the Soulard or Surrey family? And also the records indicate that Gabriel Surrey was, built, his home was built of stone, and our earliest component is also a stone home. So I don't know, there's interesting questions there, and questions that we probably will never be able to answer. But the fact that there was a building on this property prior to subdivision is referenced by Henri Soulard in the deed, and it's built of stone out in the middle of what would have been nowhere. It makes me wonder if it was some kind of outbuilding built by the Soulards or the Surreys. Next slide, please. So the property passes to the Hesh family. Next slide, please. Henri Soulard sells this lot, lot 2 of block 112 of Julia's 3rd edition to the city of St. Louis for $240 in 1847. Hesh was a mason, variably listed as a brick mason, a stone mason, and a farmer in records, who had very recently arrived from Germany with his family. So this land transfer is interesting because it is really sort of a microcosm of the development of Soulard, which many people think of Soulard as having been a French neighborhood, and it wasn't. It was owned. It was granted. The lands were granted to various people, many of whom were French, by the Spanish government. But then when it really started to develop as a neighborhood that we know, it was developed by Germans and Czechs and immigrants that were coming to St. Louis in the middle of the 19th century. So while it bears the Soulard name, it's by no means a French neighborhood. It's a neighborhood of primarily German and Czech immigrants, Bohemian immigrants. That was constructed in the middle of the 19th century after the land started to be subdivided. So the Hesh family, next slide, please, came from a town called Lauderecken in Rhineland, Germany. This is a 17th century woodcut of Lauderecken. So sort of an interesting path down the immigrant experience story. Next slide, please. Just another representation of Lauderecken that Katie found, just to give some perspective. Next slide, please. So representations of the town from which the Hesh family emigrated in the 1840s, and the actually, next slide, please. You can see it's masonry architecture, just like Soulard in many cases. So this is where the building traditions came from. Towns like this and cities across Germany. People carried these building traditions with them across the ocean and transplanted them to the New World. And this building is no exception, especially considering Hesh's background as a mason. So next slide, please. This is interesting. This is a clipping from an emigration notice published in the newspaper in Germany that people were required to serve public notice that they were leaving in case somebody claimed that they owed them money. So this is in German, but this is the Hesh is leaving, Lauterecken leaving Germany in 1846 and doing their due diligence. Next slide, please. And this is a translation of that leaflet in the newspaper. And you can see Georg Franz Hesh, bricklayer in bold there. And these are the people that were serving notice that they were leaving Germany and coming to America, and were willing to stand up and settle any claims against them. Next slide, please. So this is the path of the Hesh family from Lauterecken, basically due west to Le Havre in France, which is where many people from the German principalities departed from for the New World in the middle of the 19th century. I know my family left from Le Havre as well. And then next slide, please. We know that they traveled on the American packet boat, the Vesta, and we were able to, or Katie was able to find an actual depiction of the Vesta sailing into Le Havre. So, you know, many of us whose families came from Germany or from all over the world, you know, we don't get a chance to see what that actually looked like. But in this case, in the 1840s, this is a depiction of a packet boat that a German family traveled from Europe to the United States on. And next slide. This is a passenger manifest that shows the Hesh family. I'm not sure why he was recorded as Francois, except maybe it's because it's New Orleans. But Francis Hesh, listed as a farmer, Elizabeth, Barbara's children, Marguerite, arriving in New Orleans. And New Orleans was a common route for people who were coming to St. Louis, sail into the port of New Orleans and then come up the river. So passenger manifests exist, and we located those. Next slide, please. And so they're arriving in 1846. They're up in St. Louis by 1847 and purchasing this property from Henry Soulard. And by 1850, they're listed in the census here at the property. So the homes, the building complex must have been substantially complete by 1850. There were 11 people listed in the household. It's a working class neighborhood, clearly. The members of the family are listed at the bottom there. It's probably a little more detail than people need, but the family members, the males' occupations are listed, and they've got a tinner, got multiple bricklayers. Neighbors are cigar makers, draymen, and a watchmaker, bricklayers, tinners, carpenters, laborers. So it's interesting, I guess, to me, that you've got basically all the trades that you need right there to make these buildings happen pretty quickly. And I think that's exactly what happened. People are showing up and they need places to stay. They've got big families and they're tradespeople, and they know how to get this stuff done. So next slide, please. So this is just a little bit more detail on the occupants of the home, the builders of the home, I contend, aside from the original stone component, which I think predates the Hesh occupation and dates to the Soulard ownership. But we've got Georg, Francis, and Margaret Elizabeth, his wife. They had 8 children who all grew up in the home. One of whom, Philip George, inherits the property from his mother later and continues to live there with his family, with 13 children. He was a chair maker. He was drafted into the army during the Civil War briefly. He, like his father and mother, passed away at the home. Next slide, please. So back to the Palminteri bird's eye. Again, this is 1858. So the Heshes arrive in 1846. They're in St. Louis by 1847, purchasing property. And by 1858, the property is depicted on the map here. You can see, obviously the neighborhood's changed a lot, but you can see it's not the incredibly dense neighborhood that's depicted in 1875, but it's getting there, and it's getting there quickly. Circled in yellow, you can see the front building with the rear L. While the depiction of bays on the Palminteri map, I think, is slightly less fastidious than the Compton and Dry bird's eye. In general, it's great for looking at buildings of the era. And in this particular case, you know, it's impossible to say if they were really if they were doing sort of an artist's rendering, or if they were really trying to nail everything. But the shape of the building, if you look closely, which I know is tough to do in this format, but there's an odd shape to the front building's roof, which is, it's longer in the front, shorter in the back, with that sort of side gable. And that's exactly what our building is. And then you've got an L off the rear that's, you know, slightly shorter than the front building, with a shed roof facing to the north. And then behind it is a little one-story box with 2 bays. And behind that is a building that's no longer there. It was replaced by the alley house that's there now. But I think that's a pretty remarkable depiction of what we're dealing with now, back in 1858. And that little one-story box with the door and the window is what I hypothesize that's the stone building that may very well have been some kind of a outbuilding for Soulard activities on the property. Next slide, please. Here we are in 1875. You can see the neighborhood is filled in completely in this block. You can see St. Paul's Church, which is now the 9th Street Abbey, and the Trinity Church. Both of those are still extant, and you can see our building highlighted in blue. The spire of Trinity is sort of occluding your view there of where the rear L extends, but there is a rear L that goes back essentially to the alley house, which is also visible, forming this courtyard in the middle. Those buildings are basically all still there. And you'll see the reverse of this view with the 2 steeples in a current photograph that's coming up. So in your mind's eye, think about these 2 steeples and the house and the alley house and the L, and you'll see it in reverse perspective from the present day coming up. Next slide, please. So this is 1876, same time period as the previous map. And you can see the whole complex is completely built out as I know it today, as we know it today. You can see the front building facing 9th Street with the 2 addresses, the L extending off the end of it, the courtyard, and the alley house with a central mouse hole or gangway that allows access to 2 different units on either side there, and wood gallery porches. That's exactly what we have today, what we're working with. Next slide, please. This is sort of redundant. We can just move on. Next slide. So, we can move on through that too. This is just different map, projections that are out there, and that's kind of more for researchers' purposes. We were able to find all of these different depictions of the property. So this is just where the Heshes are today. They're in St. Peter and Paul's Cemetery. Next slide. Able to find a lot of genealogy on them. Next slide. This is extended Hesh family. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So the Hesh family controlled the property until the 1970s, when they sold it after 130 something years to associate of Youth Education and Health, YHS, and Soulard, who then donated it to Landmarks Association. So if you count the Soulards, we're the 4th owner of this property, aside from the Spanish Crown, which is pretty interesting, I think. So next slide. What are we doing down there? First, I want to thank all of our generous donors and partners who've allowed us to take on this project, including EM Harris Construction and our engineer Bill Forsyth and YEHS and our architect Rob Wagstaff and so many other people. Next slide, please. So this is what we walked into. The building has only 2 Ys thick in terms of the masonry construction, and it's very, very soft, hand pressed, low fired brick. The front wall, as I mentioned, was bowing out over the street. The south wall, which is on the left side of the image, was bowing into the gangway. There is a large tree growing into the basement on the west side. Dirt floors in the crawl spaces and basements. Multiple chimneys were collapsed. It's so old that the original floor in the house is below the current street grade. And that causes problems for ADA and other things. Next slide, please. This is the rear of the house. You can see the church steeple I referenced before, looking to the east. The conditions upon arrival when we took control of the property. The portion, you can see a difference in the stone masonry between the sort of left and right sections where the downspout comes down. The right section is much older ledge stone, and that's the original cottage component. Next slide, please. This is facing west, showing the L and the alley house and the courtyard. Next slide. This is taken from the second floor of the gallery porch on the alley house facing to the east, and there are those 2 church steeples that you can see in the Compton and Dry map. So basically the reverse of the perspective from Compton and Dry. And you can see, we'll continue with the condition photos, but it's pretty rough. And we had this, not only did we have a bit of a green roof going on, we had a bit of a green wall as well. You can see from the water overflowing. Next slide, please. This is one of the chimneys on the south side of the front building facing 9th Street that had completely failed. And that, you can see the hole in the wall, and then you can see a wall behind it. That's the building next door, through the hole in the wall. So you can see how thin those brick walls are. And when you combine that with the fragility and age of that hand-pressed, low-fired brick, it required a lot of engineering. So what we essentially ended up having to do was to build a new structure inside the old structure, so that we could retain the historic fabric on the outside as much as possible and the appearance, while adapting for current needs. Next slide, please. This is the basement in the front building after a rainstorm. Next slide, please. As you'll see, we ended up having to take down that front wall. It was just completely failing, and we weren't able to disassemble it and reuse the brick. It was just too soft and too degraded. And again, you can see that it's only a 2 wide thick wall, and then some of these interior structural components were, to say they were degraded or decayed is a bit of an understatement, especially for a large structural member like this. This is between the 1st and 2nd floor. Next slide. So as I said, we braced the wall while we got our feet under us. Next slide. This is this massive brace in more detail. Next slide, please. So then, knowing that that wall was going to have to come down and go back up, we put a lot of thought and work into matching the brick we were going to use to replace it. We didn't end up using salvaged brick for a number of different reasons that I won't get into in the interest of time. We did use a new brick on that front wall, but everything else is, we really bent over backward to make sure we saved whatever we could. That front wall had already been monkeyed with quite a bit over the years, as well. As you can see, that Rolock lug sill there, that's a totally different brick from the existing wall, and there were other things going on there. But so next slide. So here they're disassembling the front wall, taking that all the way down. You can see the dividing, that's a load-bearing dividing wall separating the 2 rooms. This front building was originally a 4-family setup with this load-bearing dividing wall in between. So the 2 first floor units each had a door, and you had 1 room with a fireplace that a family lived in. And then the 2nd floor was accessed from a rear stairway that you came to through the gangway. The 1st and 2nd floors didn't communicate internally. So we had to, in order to open those spaces up on the inside, so that we could use the spaces for our library on the 2nd floor, the Brambilla Architectural Library, and our classroom on the 1st floor, we had to remove that wall. So we had to pour a foundation in the basement, and then be able to create enough, structural strength to put in these large steel beams to carry the weight of that retaining, or that that load-bearing wall that we removed to open those into 2 large spaces. Next slide. So this is the process. ongoing process. Next slide. So this is the wall going back up. So down, it's really remarkable what masons and engineers can do. Be able to take down that whole wall and put it up again without the whole building coming down. It was quite an undertaking, but we achieved it. Next slide, please. This is a engineering component for the south wall, which is, as I mentioned, was bowing into the gangway. So this is the interior. So we poured this concrete slab in the basement and anchored these vertical supports, and then put tie rods through these supports out through the wall, and use turnbuckles to hold the wall where we needed it. We weren't able to pull it back in without causing a lot of trouble, but we were able to stabilize it so it wasn't going anywhere further. And these are all encased in the walls now. You can't see them. Next slide. So it was all boarded up, so we couldn't really see inside. So I don't have any pictures before we opened those windows up. It was just black darkness, but the conditions were very bad. As you can see, this is in what is now the reading room. Next slide, please. There were some elements of original trim, window casing, and windows that we were able to remove and refinish. And also, fortunately, we had examples, because some of that stuff survived, that we were able to replicate what was there originally throughout the building. These windows and casing were refinished, actually, and have been reinstalled. Next slide. This is the hearth in the reading room after the floor had been removed. One thing to note, the hearths, another indicator of age, the building, is that all of the fireplaces are wood burning fireplaces. They're not the narrow coal burning fireplaces that you see in later 19th century buildings throughout St. Louis. These are wide wood burning fireplaces, which means that when this building was built, there was enough wood around that it was a viable fuel source for heating and cooking. And that didn't last very long in the age of explosive population growth in the city, and of course, the concomitant need for building material, and also, of course, the steamboats and the railroads, or well, the steamboats in particular, were driving a lot of deforestation in the Mississippi Valley. So the age of the wood burning fireplace disappeared not long after these homes were built. But every fireplace in this building complex, of which there are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, approximately 8, were all wood burning hearths, then subsequently converted to stove operation. So in this particular case, going to John's gracious introduction of me, I'm very interested in archaeology, and that's my background. So we did some limited archaeological testing, and we did it here because typically the areas around fireplaces are pretty artifact rich because they're heavy activity areas. People are sitting by the fire and they're doing household activities and cooking and sitting there next to it for light and for warmth. And so a lot of stuff has a tendency to fall through the floorboards there. So we next slide, please. So we screened a lot of material from that basement area adjacent to the fireplace, and Surprisingly, we didn't really find all that much, but we did find a sort of sparse domestic assemblage. We have lamp glass and kaolin, that white clay pipe fragment, butchered pig bones and oyster shell, a few other things, but not as much as I had hoped for. But we'll interpret that when we move in, interpret that collection. I thought it was interesting, though, doing an analysis of the bone that we found, was skull fragments and teeth from pig heads, and bones from the wrist and feet of the pig. Those are the only bones that we found. And so the people that were living there, the interpretation is that they really weren't living high on the hog. They're eating, they're poor people, working class people, and they're eating off cuts or less desirable cuts, cooking a pig's head and cooking a pig's foot. And that's the bones that we found. So that's interesting as well, I think, from an anthropological standpoint. Next slide. So the muddy mess, but progress as the plumbing and drainage system for the courtyard is going in. The yellow line is highlighting the original home. You can, which would have, so that faces to the north, one door, one window, one story. The second layer of brick is a later addition. So it would have almost certainly been a side gable home, one story with probably a loft, constructed of ledge stone. And the stone is very weathered and thin and soft, and it comes probably either out of the bluff or a nearby creek bed. It's not stone from a deep quarry, which you would find later in the 19th century from a formal quarry. This is this is stone that's essentially being collected from the surface or near the surface. But then when the Heshes move in, they get right to work. And as we saw before on that 1858 map, the second floor had been added, at least in some capacity. The front building that you're looking at the rear of now had been added, and part of the L connecting the old building to the newer building had also been added. And just a word of warning in the materials department, the old stone portion had been partially tuck pointed with concrete, and that rather than mortar. And that concrete is much harder than the stone that it was binding. And so when the stone would absorb moisture, it would butt up against that harder concrete, and it was sort of crushing itself. So it was a difficult and very painstaking removal and tuck pointing process, so that we could preserve that original stone portion. And if you come down and see, which I hope you will, you'll see how thick these walls are. They're really massive, massive stone walls. Next slide.
We got about 5 minutes left, Andrew.
Yep, I'm wrapping up. So yeah, just another challenge. This is us building the opening things up for our atrium space, which is in the rear of the building. We needed to steal some space so that we could build a staircase to get to the second floor, an ADA, well, a modern staircase. So we built a glass atrium, which you'll see in a second here. Next slide. So again, this is the vision. Next slide. A vision for the courtyard, so we can have an indoor outdoor space there. Next slide. Some of the interesting things we discovered on the interior. None of the lumber is uniform. It varies a lot in its width and dimensions. These subfloor boards, some of these subfloor boards are 24 inches wide. They're all over the place. And all of this sort of stuff is to be interpreted for students. We also have some interesting hardware. We have some nails that are actually blacksmith finished nails. They're not fully machine cut nails. So some early stuff. Next slide. You can see the sheathing boards in the attic to the variation of dimensions all over the place, and they're gapped, which was aside from the photograph that we have, is another indication, confirmation that the original roof was a shake roof, because the shake roofs are designed, they gap the sheathing board so that they can dry from the inside as well as the outside after a rainstorm. Next slide. So here we are putting the shake roof back on the primary building. Next slide. Another thing to be interpreted for students is the kerf marks that are on the most of the structural members are all vertical reciprocating saw rather than the later curved circular saw kerf marks or striations that you would see on structural aspect, or just lumber in a building like this. So it's an earlier technology than the circular saw. Next slide. Not so interesting. Next slide. Construction of our atrium. Next slide. This was the other day. We went to a lot of trouble, as I said, to replicate the details of the original photo, down to the custom doors. We had, with the support of a lot of donors, we had operable Douglas fir shutters installed. So those work. We can close those. For Mardi Gras or anything else we need to close them for. You can see the transoms are there and the 6/6s. Next slide, just a close up of the shutters and the shutter dogs. Next slide, beautiful doors. Next slide. This is an office. You can see some of the original material. This door and this original mantle remain in place and are being restored. And will stay where they were. And that's a original mantle that we used to fabricate the replacement ones we needed. So here's a room in our library, which they're installing floors in right now. We left that window up to the attic dormer in the ceiling there to get capture the natural light, and also to show people the interesting joists that are in there, and those vertical kerf marks I mentioned. Next slide. It's part of our classroom on the first floor. Next slide. And this is the new reception area atrium that allowed us to install the large stair we needed to access the second floor internally. Next slide. This is our new stair. This is brand new. Next slide. Next slide. So our big challenge right now is finishing the courtyard and the hardscape out there. And part of the challenge there is that it's north facing and it's completely enclosed by other buildings, so it gets very, very little light. Next slide. And when it snows or other things, that snows from last winter, and that stuck around almost until this winter. So there's some challenges there from a hardscape and landscaping standpoint. But next slide. So anyway, if anyone would like to help continue to support this effort, we would be very grateful. And we should be moving into the building this winter. And we'll start programming the space with talks like this and school groups and all the rest of it, and reopening the library in the spring. That's the plan. So next slide. Probably shouldn't have ended here because it showcases my lack of Photoshop skills, but this is what we've been up to. So that's the end of my talk, and I'm sorry I went a little bit over time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew.
You're
Very
welcome. Thank you for having me.
I don't think we're going to have time for questions this evening, but I wanted to thank everybody for attending tonight. It's been wonderful hearing all about the history of this area and this building. And I want to let everyone know that we'll be continuing this speaker series next year. I'm not sure when it'll be starting again, but we'll definitely have plenty of notice on our website and various forums. So hope you can attend in 2023 for this tie of Architectural Historian St. Louis chapter and the St. Louis Public Library Steedman Architectural Library Series. Thank you.
Trent, if I can just say, if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out to me through the Landmarks website or via email. You can definitely find me online. I'm happy to talk.
Okay.
Obviously.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for attending. Hope you have a good night. Good night.
Right.